Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Metahumanism podcast and the second special episode. This is the podcast and the channel where we discuss the contemporary world at the intersection of metahumanism, metamodernism, and decolonialism. So today's last special episode was focused on the 7 levels of war. And today I want to continue that discussion and focus on this very interesting concept of Ukrobuddhism. So briefly to recap the last episode, the 7 levels of war were the war for the Ukrainian identity, for the subjectivity, which is connected to the decolonizational process. That was level 1. Level 2 was the war between Russia and Ukraine, the actual conflict between the states. Level 3 is the war between NATO and USSR, two kind of a former USSR, or the Russian attempt to reestablish an empire. So that's level 3. Level 4 was the war of the status quo and the uncertainty of what's to come next. The status quo, the world order, and the coming uncertainty, which connects to the whole notion of metamodernism and the oscillations between sincerity and irony, and again uncertainty and definition or determination. Next, level 5 is the war between USA and China, a more geoeconomic war on a different level. 6th level is war between the world of roads, or again geoeconomics, and the world of borders. That's more geopolitical level, and how these are not constrained to specific states within each of the powers, within each player, so to speak. There are these different forces. And then last and ultimate level is the ontological level, or geocultural war for values. Good versus evil is one way of putting it, but and this connects, one might say, to metahumanism in my perspective. So let's go a little bit more deeply into that, specifically focus on the ontological level first and foremost. But before that, I just want to make a few remarks that from Ukraine's perspective, levels 1 and 7, which means the war for identity and subjectivity, and the ontological war are most important strategically for Ukraine, because that's where the Ukraine can have the most impact. In the intermediate levels, or the levels where other players are involved, the EU, the USA, the allies, Russian military machine, Ukraine doesn't have a very direct impact or influence over those factors, and it just has to do what it can to fight its war for independence, existential war on the ground, and then also to fight the war on the level of ontology and values and narratives. So those are 2 levels that are most, as counterintuitive as that might seem, the topmost level and the bottom most level are the 2 most strategically important levels for Ukraine. Despite being at war with a larger power of Russia, Ukraine, for the past 3, almost 4 years, has been able to withstand that assault and to show that its willingness to protect and defend itself against these imperial encroachments is beyond doubt. Okay, so Ukraine is actively participating in this process of defining its subjectivity and being and claiming its place under the sun, so to speak, in the attempt to join the international arena of nation states on its own terms, countering the imperialist mythology constructed by Moscow in the past centuries, and establishing its own ontological narrative that has been suppressed and ignored for much too long. And this new identity that Ukraine is working hard to establish it's an open identity. It's centered in human dignity and connects to my own metahumanist synthesis in many ways, or motivates it, which I plan to present at the beginning of the next podcast season next year. I'm preparing for that, but so this connects to it. That's why I wanted to record these two special episodes. And maybe this new Ukrainian identity can become a spark that ignites and defines a flame, a larger flame, larger fire, and defines the new world order. I don't want to make it sound violent, meaning the light, the spark for the new light, for the new iteration of world order, where notion of us, quote unquote, becomes synonymous with being human, or meta-human, if you will, which would mean moving beyond anthropocentrism of classical humanism towards a more ecological and embodied and situated worldview. So the world is in transition currently. That's beyond any doubt. So that's we can think of it as a level 4, where the status quo, it comes up against uncertainty. What will come next? How the world will look in the next 5, 10, 15 years. The post-World War II order is already dead, one might say. It's pretty clear. For all intents and purposes, things will not be as they were up till now. The new world has not emerged yet. So the uncertainty is very palpable. It's time for global powers when the global powers are kind of struggling and competing and trying to define the new reality by proposing different narratives and defining their new identities in this kind of climate of us versus them, tribalism. So there are different ways this can go, and here is where I want to make a reference to this report, Global Trends 2040, which was published, National Intelligence Report, which was published in the US by the National Security, National Intelligence officials some years ago, and I will link to it so you can, if you want to read it in more detail, you can. So it was released 1 year before the Russian aggressive escalation against Ukraine in 2022, and the report kind of became almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. So it proposed 5 scenarios. First one was Renaissance of democracies. Again, the horizon is the line of horizon is 2040. So Renaissance of democracies, meaning the technological and cultural development that is led by the USA and their allies. Public-private partnerships are established, rising standards of living. Russia and China, on the other hand, decline and become more authoritarian, even more than today. That's one scenario possible. Right now, the things are not looking that they are developing in this way. The second scenario corresponds more to what the moment we're in right now, and that's called a world adrift. The world system becomes chaotic, loses its priorities and direction. International rules and global challenges such as climate change, global health, and so on, are ignored. Economies slow down. Societies become more atomized. And communities as well become more atomized, and that atomization increases, and China grows its influence. That seems to be happening. Scenario 3 was competitive coexistence, where USA and China compete in economic and commercial spheres, accompanied by the political and technological struggle for hegemony as well. But in this scenario, global war is unlikely, and this enables cooperation to address some of the global challenges such as climate change, health, and so on. Scenario 4, which is looming on the horizon. So we're really in a world adrift scenario right now, but it may come to scenario number 4, which is separate silos, and that's a fragmented world of multiple security and economic blocks, a multipolar world as some of the strategists argue for, especially China is favored favoring this kind of world, and Russia as well. They argue and they are proponents of this vision. So there's these clusters of China, Russia, USA, the EU, and maybe some regional powers such as India and Brazil and some others. The focus is on regional security, resilience, and self-reliance. Supply chains and cyberspace also become fragmented in this world, and the lesser powers have to kind of align with one of the poles in this multipolar system, or suffer exclusion from this from the constellation of power in general. And then the last scenario is tragedy and mobilization, and that's kind of a you could call it apocalyptic scenario, whether a global coalition is led by the EU and China. For very conspicuously, USA is absent from this scenario in the report, and this global coalition cooperates with NGOs to reform the international organizations and address the global challenges. And this happens only after a global catastrophe that caused by climate cataclysms and environmental degradation. So a global economy kind of transitions to more renewable sources of energy. So those are 5 scenarios. Again, Renaissance of democracies was the first, second world adrift, which is where we are now, competitive coexistence, separate silos, which is where we might be headed to, and finally tragedy and mobilization. So these are 5 potentials. Not that it is exhaustive and others can be imagined, but this is what, just for as a point of reference. And so to talk about the ontological level of war, let's define what that means. It's not just about good versus evil. That's a little bit too simplistic and too black and white. Being good doesn't guarantee victory in this struggle, and being bad or evil does not guarantee punishment. As we can see, for example, on the situation with Gaza and Israel. There's blurred categories of what's good and evil and what's good and bad, and that is a very clear example. Transactionality and cynical exercise of naked power tend to undermine value-based politics these days. Instead, so good becomes good, quote unquote, becomes defined pragmatically as whichever narrative can hold people's attention the longest and the most effectively. That's the good. That becomes defined as good. So analyzing this transition from a world adrift to the separate silo scenario, it is possible to say that the new clusters of power will coalesce around different ontological views of modes of being, of modes of perceiving reality, selecting values, and defining what good and evil are. So these are competing ontological views. And so the ontological war means a struggle for this ability to define reality and define being within the constraints of this current situation. And it's a form of strategic positioning directed to undermine or impose the fundamental assumptions about being, identity, meaning, meanings in life, and legitimacy of the political and social order. So ontological war may include deception, sometimes psyops, disinformation, all of that, but only as situational micro-instruments. The main goal is to impose one's own vision of reality onto the opponent and onto the other players or other actors. Whatever corresponds to that vision is defined as truth. Whatever the ontological vision an actor chooses, and everything else are lies. So here this echoes this related conception of a hybrid or informational war, which is being used quite widely today. So the resulting ontological positions may be somewhat vague. They don't necessarily have to be very clearly cut, because the more open-ended platforms are better able to attract allies and persuade people than the more closed and categorical ones. So more people can be persuaded if there's some fluidity or vagueness involved. So the categories of good versus evil, us versus them, and the resulting identities may become diffused and poorly defined because of that. So this is something that we have to understand and grapple with. So this kind of ontological situation is accompanied by this transition from postmodernism to metamodernism. So in this context, the competition continues for the ability to define the narrative and dominate the technological sphere, at least in one's so-called macro region, so in one's sphere of influence, as it used to be known. So both postmodern and metamodern instruments are used for achieving these goals by the actors. And in any combination that's pragmatic or whatever it works, that best effective and is the best fit for the situation. So in that sense, today, countering disinformation and promoting media literacy are kind of already things of the past. Many people have not achieved them, but they already becoming obsolete in some ways because they cannot help in the struggle for the future. Why? Because no power pretends today to tell the truth anymore, the objective truth. They only say what they truly believe and want to be true. So their narratives don't necessarily pretend to be the universal truth, but they only present a certain version of truth which each actor believes in and defines reality as. So the postmodern ironic play of self-conscious kind of relativism is play of empty simulacra, empty copies is over. It's here more than the Matrix. A more apt metaphor for this meta-modern world is a film Everything Everywhere All at Once. And that is kind of a symbol of what metamodernity may brings and means. So therefore, there's no quote-unquote objective reality in this metamodern kind of world. The only possible defense is to establish and expand one's own identity, culture, and structure of reality. So instead of trying to undermine other, deconstruct everything, the point is to construct your own version and your own conception of reality and live as if it were true, or make it true in a sense. So to propose something positive and to embody that proposal in life. So this is why it's so important for Ukraine to introduce the world to her culture, so that the world feels familiarity with the culture, with Ukrainians, and feels the need to protect that which is familiar. Just saying that Russia is bad is not enough anymore, and it's important to demonstrate why Ukraine is also good. So to be successful in defining her identity, Ukraine needs a code. That's where this Ukrobuddhism, the conception of Ukrobuddhism comes in, which is sincere but also ironic about this code of the builder of Ukrobuddhism, kind of which the author of this conception, Dmytro Zolotukhin, I'm relying upon. He is a media expert and former deputy minister of information policy between 2017 and 2019. And so it's an ironic kind of play on there used to be known a code of the builder of communism in the Soviet times. So this is an ironic play on that notion, just making fun of it, of this conception, but also being sincere about this conception of Ukrobuddhism and what it means. So before we really talk about Ukrobuddhism, I want to just present and summarize the four ontological positions of the main kind of clusters of power in the current world. And that would be China, Russia, USA, and Europe, the EU. Europe, the EU is just one part of Europe. So let's begin with China. China's ontological position is multipolarity, as I already mentioned, a fragmented world without universal human rights, where LGBTQIA plus rights, Uyghur rights, for example, the local multiculturalism is denied, balance of power is glorified, rule of force transactions based on mutual benefits, but not universal values. So China openly claims that democracy and human rights are not for their civilization. State is above the individual, right? The collective above the individual, and the ethnic and cultural diversity is rejected. It's not a fake claim. It's just how they structure their reality using propaganda technologies and metamodern instrumentation. It's impossible to debunk or fact check this kind of narrative. It's not true or false. It's just that's what their reality is defined as, and it's you can't really argue or say it's not correct. It's just that's what they see themselves and their reality, and so they're being sincere of viewing the world this way. Multipolar and fragmented world without the universalism of human rights is more based on equal rights of different civilizational models instead. So it's somewhat relativistic in that sense. The exercise of power, influence, border enforcement, the world of borders is relevant here as opposed to the world of roads, including in cyberspace, the fragmentation of cyberspace. So collectivism becomes a more important value than individualism, state, nation, or community above and before the individual. So this is basically resistance to the so-called rules-based order that existed since World War II, and it's an alternative to Euro-Atlantic model, which includes such structures as the UN, NATO, OECD, G7, and so on. So China kind of constructing the BRICS and other regional arrangements, it's constructing an alternative to that kind of world order. You might say it gradual and quote-unquote gentle undermining of the existing world order. So that's one. Russia's ontological position is next, and that's, in many ways, it's really parasitic and radicalized version of China's vision. So Russia, it's viewed itself historically as the third Rome, after Roman, Byzantine, and then the Muscovite special civilization, quote unquote, or Russian world, as they call it. They see it as messianic, almost messianic destiny, the last white hope. Sometimes it's billed that way. Traditionalism, traditional values, defender of traditional values, which basically means homophobia, sexism, racism, xenophobia, and so on. So, but in reality, Russia is an ontological desert. It's full of nihilism, destruction, emptiness, and abyss. That's what the war with Ukraine has revealed very clearly to the world, that there's no positive vision. It's just about destruction and nihilism and power and naked power, and imperialist desire to reestablish domination. It's an ontological desert where the ruling class in Russia kind of lives in this paradigm of real gulag ontology and its criminal subculture, and tries to justify it by referring to separate civilization and the uniqueness and so on. But in effect, it's derivative of the Chinese model. It's more radicalized because each proxy kind of must always be more radical than the original conception. So the main goal of this synthetic fake ontology on the part of Russia is to separate Russia from the European ontological space, which Russia in the 18th century, Peter I and then Catherine II tried to construct the Russian Empire as part of this European constellation of empires, right? So now Russia is trying to remove itself from European context and propose that it's the civilization of its own that's unique and self-reliant. Now, USA is the next ontological position I want to look at. And that's currently, basically, to sum it up, USA is undergoing a very deep crisis due to the Trump administration's assault on constitutional republicanism and the rule of law. Basically, this is, one might conceptualize it as transition from that law of order and the liberal republicanism through techno-fascism into this some version of homo deus, That's one of the conceptions of the historian Harari, and I can link that in the description to the video for those who are unfamiliar. So we could say that Homo Deus is knocking on the door of Homo sapiens through biotechnology, AI developments, and these fantasies about immortality, and the path to Homo Deus, this kind of post-human being with technocratic omnipotence, according to this thinker Harari, it's not possible to make that transition to Homo Deus without going first through this stage that's called Homo Ludens, or the playing man. Playing human, playing humanity, playful humanity. So the significance of this will become clear in just a moment. So just keep that in mind, Homo Ludens. So currently the US is experiencing a very deep ontological and political crisis, and this model which helped US prevail in the Cold War, the democracy and the republicanism, and hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, which was a kind of a fake ontological adversary at the time. It became hollowed out from within and collapsed on itself. So this model, the republicanism, the liberal democracy, helped create a unique situation of US domination in the digital realm as well, because the communications architecture and the logic of the social networks were based in American cultural codes largely, and reinforced by the global cultural and technological hegemony in recent decades. But that model is now under attack, and the mythology of the American dream is no longer sustainable, if it ever were, and its hypocrisies helped usher in this current political crisis, really. So US is grappling for new meanings and new understanding of itself. The crisis may well last a long time. It's hard to predict more than one electoral cycle, possibly because the 2028 elections are coming pretty quickly. It's not they're not that far away, and it's not clear that this crisis will be resolved before then. Hopefully it will, but it's hard to predict what will happen. And until it is resolved, much of the political attention of the U.S. elites will be directed inwardly and to the domestic issues, as it makes sense. And so it leaves certain power vacuum in the global arena. Europe's ontological position is the last one in the four, and then we'll go into Ukrobuddhism and Ukraine's position. So Europe's ontological position basically currently also being reevaluated and reformulated, and this Dmitro Zolotukhin in this describing Ukrobuddhism kind of Ukraine and Europe are intertwined. Their destiny is intertwined almost inextricably. So this vision of new or greater Europe is something that Europe needs to. That it's being proposed that Ukrobuddhism and this vision of great Europe are intertwined and help each other and are can emerge, can be co-created if approached in the right way. So Europe as an ocean is not just about geography, it's a kind of field of being. Its borders are defined not by armies or treaties in present day, but by shared ontology of values, the dignity of the individual, value of freedom, and the belief in human life as the highest good. And among all the ontological positions so far, that's the only one really in the contemporary world that still posits the individual life and the value of the individual as the highest value. So this is something that's important to underscore. The ontology stretches eastward, at least to the lands of former Kievan Rus. It was always part of Europe, and but no further than the Urals. That's a geographical boundary of European continent as it's defined. Beyond that frontier, the person ceases to be the center of being, and the collective absorbs the soul in some ways. not necessarily making the distinctions between good and bad or good and evil here. I'm just saying the Eastern the cultures and civilization tend to be more collectivistic in that sense. But modern Europe lost its ontological center in the 20th century because of the two world wars, which shattered the imperial egos of the European empires. And then the Marshall Plan replaced that meaning with management and American domination and protection, which now is clearly lapsing, and Europe is waking up slowly to that. It has woken up by now. But because that management and then the American dominance fostered dependence in terms of military and security infrastructure. So European will kind of learned to avoid conflict at any cost. That's one of the problems. Because this European project is trapped by its own absolute pacifism. So to preserve life, it avoids confrontation with Russia even. So, and even when this avoidance means the sacrifice of others, meaning Ukrainian lives. So Ukraine exposes this weakness because by defending its dignity, Ukraine reminds Europe of what it once was, a civilization founded on the sanctity of the person and not the comfort of the system or institutions. Europe's path forward is not just another federation or another empire, it's ontological leadership, leadership by example, not by dominance. So Kiev may be thought of as the second Jerusalem, which was kind of in times of Kievan Rus, when the Volodymyr the Great baptized, chose the Byzantine Christianity and baptized his subjects. That was his idea, is to build the second Jerusalem on the river of Dnipro, Kiev being that city. And so that idea can be revived and must become a spiritual axis of this renewed kind of Europe. A city of Kiev is a city of tragedy and play, faith without empire. So only by recovering this metaphysical courage can Europe endure in the coming century. To rejuvenate this capacity to act for truth and not merely for security or in acting from fear. And this means also overcoming the legacy of imperialist trauma and war through irony, empathy, and freedom, becoming a living proof for the global South that contemporary empires cannot oppose humanity, meaning Russia and China, they cannot oppose humanity and the value of human life. The ontological conception of this great Europe can reconcile the European fear of Russia with the necessity to defeat the empire within Russia, which is a precondition for Ukraine's survival. There is no third term here. Either the Russian imperial project survives, or Ukraine survives as an independent country and nation, and which defeats the imperial project of Russia. Some fraction of the population of the European part of the Russian Federation can become part of this ontological great Europe vision after de-imperialization of Russia. So that's just the kind of situation we're facing. So lastly and finally, we come to Ukraine's ontological position, which is this conception of Ukrobuddhism kind of addresses. It's not the only possible, but it's fascinating to me because I practice kind of meditation in a Tibetan Buddhist tradition. I've explored it several years ago, and now I'm returning to that practice. It's both for mental health reasons and for spiritual reasons. And it's very important to my worldview. That's why this concept of Ukrobuddhism kind of sparked my attention, and I wanted to share it with you as well. So this is in this discussion of Europe, that's the point where Ukraine comes in. the point of this, the necessity for Europe to become the ontological leader. So, and within Europe, Ukraine can serve as a core of that leadership, ontological leadership. In some ways, just as Russia is more radical form of China's ontological platform, Ukraine presently is a more radical version of the European ontology because the difference, the ontology of human dignity and the value of human life. Is what I mean. The difference between the two situations is that the integration of Chinese and Russian ontologies actually dates as far back as early 20th century, and has proceeded through the decades and in the past century through various periods of convergence, which was during the Stalin-Mao rapprochement, and divergence, which was since the Sino-Soviet split and the Nixon's and Kissinger's China policy in the 1970s. So now the Xi and Putin are kind of again joining their destinies together in some ways, with China being dominant one this time. Ukraine is not simply a state under attack. It's a living experiment in being, one might say. It's an ontological laboratory at the edge of chaos. The European absolute pacifism, which I already mentioned just now, tries to avoid conflict at all cost, but it must be broken because otherwise Europe may not endure in its current form, this current conflagration. Realistically, Ukraine cannot resist Russia and North Korea with Iran's and China's silent backing in the background completely alone, and it needs Europe and also United States as well to help defeat this imperial project. So the decline of Europe is tied to the fate of Ukraine, and this is a two-way street. So we don't know which one will determine the other. Either the decline of Europe will lead to Ukraine's defeat, or Ukraine's defeat might precipitate the ultimate decline of Europe. It's a two-way street here. So it's, as I said, it's intertwined. These destinies are intertwined quite significantly. So this is why historians talk about Ukraine being the gates of Europe. This I'm quoting the title of the book by Serhiy Plokhy, a Harvard historian, and also as the land where the flow of European history was decided at various points, historical junctures. And today we're living through one of those moments when the history of Europe is defined by what happens in Ukraine. So Ukraine's modern evolution runs from the ontology of the victim, which is born of famine, Stalinist famine, repression, and genocide, towards the ontology of play, the worldview of Homo ludens, the playing human, which I mentioned just before when discussing USA. So this was Johan Huizinga, Dutch cultural historian. In his sense, play is not entertainment, it's freedom in action. Creation within catastrophe. It's an ontological way of being. So it's not about who is weak or strong, who's winner or loser. It's about style, dignity, aesthetics of play. It's about the beauty of the process, not only the efficiency of the ultimate result. So at the same time, having said that, let's remind ourselves some of the phrases that the Ukrainian President Zelensky spoke. He said, "I'm not playing cards," when he was visiting the Trump administration in the White House. And the commander-in-chief of the armed forces in Ukraine at some point said, "At least we don't need to be ashamed anymore for putting up the resistance to the invasion in 2022. So both of these moments point to the fact that Ukraine cannot fully commit to the ontology of play. It's not all fun and games, in other words, because Ukraine is constantly in the state of existential threat and struggle for survival. So the ontology of play needs to be fully committed to it means making free choices, having at least some minimal distance from the possibility of catastrophe, but because the catastrophe is where the ontology of the victim, pain, and survival predominates. So tragedy mobilizes, which we see on the example of Ukraine these days, but it takes away the space of free movement also. So constraints of this war on what Ukraine can do right now. So that's where Ukrobuddhism, the notion of Ukrobuddhism arises. An ironic and yet sincere and paradoxical and yet lucid philosophy of survival and dignity in the face of horrible suffering. Suffering and empathy are integral to this Ukrobuddhist worldview, but trauma does not become totemic. It's not glorified. It serves only as a source for self-awareness and inner focus and deeper vision. So suffering and trauma cannot keep Ukrobuddhists from leaving the ontology of the victim behind, because suffering and trauma can have no power over Ukrobuddhists. Suffering is part of the game, but not, it's part of the situation, let's say a game or a situation, but it's not its meaning. It's not the core of what it's all about. The Ukrobuddhist does not react to the suffering or to disinformation or to propaganda in a knee-jerk fashion. The Ukrobuddhist transmutes the suffering into something good and powerful and beautiful. Just like in Buddhism and Tantric Buddhism specifically teaches. He turns the battlefield into a stage, the trauma into art, the absurd into meaning. Coffee in the trenches, memes amid explosions, that's not escapism, it's ontology under fire, basically. So forged in fire. Ukraine, and again, it's not meant to glorify the suffering and the horrible deaths of all the innocent civilians and children and the kidnappings of thousands of children. This is just what it is. It's ontology forged in fire. Because they're not reactive, Ukraine offers an alternative that's not tied to either the past or the future. It's radically present in the moment. The image of the player, according to Huizinga, is not tied to power, wealth, or even progress. The reality of the Ukrainian resistance and culture is not to win at any cost, but to secure the style and meaning in any possible position one finds itself in. It's a profound alternative to the world of control or algorithmic control or otherwise that is being offered by all the other players, actors that I described, China, Russia, even US, and Europe is kind of struggling as well. So because they're European and now within Europe, Ukrainian ontological position is the only one that sort of focuses on the dignity and of human life. So because they're not reactive, the Ukrobuddhists don't obsess about countering the propaganda, the psyops, and debunking lies and fake news. It's part of it, but it's not the focus. It's not the main goal. They simply create their own cultural space, their own memes, their own value of coexistence, changing the battlefield in the process of doing all of that, and transforming chaos into an arena of action and play. There's no imperative to impose or some determined order on this chaos in this arena. So chaos is part of the constellation of forces, let's say, and you just have to grapple with it and live with it, not necessarily impose some clear order on everything. It may not be possible. So Ukrobuddhists do not treat reality too seriously because they generate their own meaning. They do not accept any external definitions of what the sacred is and what sacred things and phenomena are, because all sacredness can be manually generated. This is understood. The main style of communication between Ukrobuddhists and reality is irony and self-reflection. So this is a very metamodern trait. Ukrobuddhists are not susceptible to propaganda or disinformation as readily because they generate so many of their own meanings that they simply don't have time to consume the distorted meanings produced by the enemy. The instruments of reflexive control and manipulation, which people in US glorify, people in other, definitely in Russia and China and Iran and other players, Israel, Europe, everywhere, this kind of reflexive control and manipulation, psyops in other words, they are used by all global players, but they don't work on Ukrobuddhists on this because they are ready to play. Ukrobuddhists are ready to play many games and inhabit many roles. Ukrobuddhists know who they are, but they can be anyone and play any role, and they can refuse to be any of those roles if they want to, and become directors for their own, for other characters, or just even spectators, not directors. So their goal is not to win a debate, but to rewrite the very meaning of what it means to have a debate. The Ukro-Buddhist is ungovernable in some sense because they make meaning faster than propaganda can corrupt that meaning. They do not fight for empires, but for consciousness itself. Their weapon is irony, then their defense is empathy. So their faith is dignity and freedom are not goals, but ways of being. So Ukraine, suffering a tragedy, chooses not vengeance, but a mindful game, and can become an archetype for such a transition to that kind of way of being. This changes the place in the global structure of constellation of power. Through this ontology of the game of play, Ukraine becomes an antipode to three empires, USA, China, Russia, not in any hostile sense, but as an alternative to their ontological views. Ukrobuddhism rejects all these sacred empires. It places no God, no state, no progress above the human being. It values style over strategy, presence over power. And against Russia's fatalism, it offers inner freedom. Against America's utilitarianism, sincere irony. Against China's order, affectionate play. Ukraine does not aim to win the old game. It rewrites the rules of the game. So again, to revisit that notion of Homo ludens, it stands between Homo sapiens on one hand and Homo deus on the other hand, between the thinking human and the self-creating God, the two poles. And so the Homo ludens oscillates between these two poles in a meta-modern fashion. Without play, divinity turns to tyranny. But through play, even suffering becomes creation. Through this ontology, Ukraine becomes the mirror of Europe's forgotten soul. A civilization that does not seek to conquer, but to play nobly, even when surrounded by ruin. That's what we're talking about. And the fact that the president of Finland, for example, talks about Team Europe, and that the European leaders collectively will pay for the American weapons to supply to Ukraine, means that this process of European awakening is already underway, which is a source of optimism, may serve as a source of optimism. Perhaps the biggest enemy of this process, though, is the primitive provincialism and tribalism, focusing exclusively on one's own backyard and ignoring everything else. And these forces are also active in Europe, and they are being encouraged by Russia and China and other players like that. The Ukro-Buddhist ontology must calibrate its own system of us versus them in a way as not to exclude foreigners, but to transform them into us. And the law about multiple citizenships, which was adopted in June of this year, is a step in that direction. Of course, the actual implementation of that war will be which is what will matter in the end. It's not clear how it will be implemented just yet. But ontologically speaking, it doesn't matter what passport you hold if you can be simultaneously a Ukrainian, a European, and a Ukro-Buddhist. So this identities become more fluid and more readily redefined. So to paraphrase a line from a Ukrainian poet from 1960s who said, "You know that you're a human being." So you can say, "You know that you're a meta-human." That's updated version of that for the 21st century. To the ontologies of superstates, Ukro-Buddhism opposes the ontology of superhumans, or metahumans, if you will, who refuse to play the role of the victim, or the instrument of God, or empires, or the New World Order. Ultimately, all empires fall, all faith becomes more loving and patient, and all world orders are rearranged. So the only thing that does not change in all of this is humanity and its love of play. So finally, just to close today's episode, I want to compare the classical Buddhist notions and the Ukro-Buddhist parallels. So, for example, dukkha, or the life is suffering, which is one of the noble truths of Buddhism. In Ukro-Buddhist interpretation, suffering is the texture of existence, inevitably, but also it's a ground for creation, creating new values and reaffirming the old values which have become forgotten. Second principle of Buddhism is anatta, or non-self. So it's a very complicated notion. I won't go into details, but it's not a denial of our existence of a self altogether. It's just a denial of the the essence of the self. The self is a process and fluid, and it changes. It's impermanent, and that's in Ukro-Buddhism interpretation. That's what it becomes: fluid selfhood, role shifting, and irony in this context of horrible suffering. Third concept in Buddhism, which is important, is anicca, or impermanence, which I already had just hinted at. And that's in Ukro-Buddhist parallel. There is acceptance of death and the ruin as the rhythm of life, and just you have to go through it to get to the other side, to transcend it. You can't escape it. Fourth important notion is karma, causality through intention, right? So that's a very important notion in all dharmic religions, but Buddhism as well, and worldviews. And in Ukro-Buddhist approach, it's creative causality. It's to act with awareness and humor, even when the outcome is uncertain and unpredictable. Fifth notion is nirvana. So that's liberation from attachment. Classical definition. And in Ukro-Buddhist interpretation, that's freedom through detachment within engagement. So it's not removing yourself from the world or becoming indifferent to things, but actually being engaged, more actively engaged, but being detached from the day-to-day pain and suffering that this kind of war and this kind of horrific genocidal war brings. That's the way to survive and to get through it. Sixth important notion is karuna. That's compassion in the Buddhist tradition. And so in Ukro-Buddhist interpretation also, it's empathy without sentimentality, not idiot compassion, like, oh, I feel too bad for you. No, you're sincere in your empathy, your understanding the suffering of the other, but you don't do it on a superficial level, but on a deep and meaningful level. You really relate to the other and to their suffering. And then the last notion I want to highlight is the middle way. In Buddhism, it's between the nihilism of nothing is important, nothing matters, no values, and eternalism of there is some essence, ourself is essential, unchanging, and eternal. So Buddhism walks a middle way between these two poles. And so in a Ukro-Buddhist interpretation, it becomes balance between tragedy and play. So neither victims nor winners. Ukrainians are fighting for their dignity, for their existence, and for their value of human life. They're putting the lives of their soldiers above everything else. All the ideologies and all the other considerations or the interests of the state fade in the face of this ultimate concern of human life. So in essence, Buddhism works on dissolving the ego and to end suffering, and Ukro-Buddhism dissolves tragedy to create meaning out of the suffering. So both are paths of awakening, and the Ukrainian version is just awakening under bombardment, literally. So daily bombardment. This happens every day as we speak. So it's enlightenment, but not a lotus blooming in stillness, but a flower growing from the ashes, to put it poetically. Okay, well, this is everything I wanted to say, and that's why I wanted to record these two special episodes. I want to dedicate today's episode, by the way, because it's November the 1st, and this is why I decided to record it today, is because it's very symbolic date in Ukrainian history. This is when the Western Ukrainian People's Republic was established in 1918, when the Ukrainians in Lviv, where I come from, they revolted against the Polish authorities at the time that were controlling the western part of Ukraine, and they established an independent Western Ukrainian People's Republic, which a year later, joined with the Ukrainian People's Republic on the eastern central parts, joined together in one united Ukrainian state and nation, which unfortunately lost to the Bolsheviks and was again dismembered after the Polish Bolshevik War. It's a very complicated history, but this was an important period, a moment of Ukrainian revolution, where Ukrainians made the claim to become a self-determining, self-reliant nation and state, and unfortunately they weren't able to keep that in early 20th century, and so century onward, and we're still continuing that struggle today. And I wanted to dedicate these two special episodes to that history and to the continuing struggle that I have no doubt Ukrainians will win, and in some ways have already won in ontological terms. Thank you for being here. Please continue supporting Ukraine, or consider becoming a supporter in some way. Every little bit helps. And support this content, like, share, comment, and so on. You know what to do if you're familiar with social media and how it works. So thank you again, and I will see you probably next time. That will be next year, when I return with the second episode with a changed format and a very different focus. And I will present my own philosophical synthesis, metahumanist manifesto, and go on from there. Okay, thank you very much.